Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, yes, cool. All right, let's take it away. I'm very excited. I think if you've been paying attention so far with the data catalogs and then the events, I feel like I'm in the right room here. My talk today, really, it's just data. It's a people problem. I find that, as we've heard, there are shiny tools, there are great technical implementations out there, but often it kind of like falls short of what success looks like. So understanding the socio-technical elements, this interface between data and people and data, yeah, let's kick it off. So I don't want to talk too much about me, but I think just to give some context, I joined 99 Designs about like 4 years ago. About 100 people there joined as like their first data engineer, rolled out like the modern data stack. We had a small central data team. Our company grew. We moved into the hub and spoke model. Then we got acquired by Vista, joined a kind of like global 1,000-person company. Very different ball game. So this talk is some lessons learned and some things that I think dealing with people and what really makes our company like thrive in this like data mesh kind of innovative landscape. Data practitioners, I just wanted to call this out because there was that paper that was published by Tristan a few weeks ago talking about wearing hats, not badges. I think we're still trying to figure out, with an analytics engineer, who's doing what. And I really want to be mindful of the audience here when I talk about the different themes and context. That if I touch on anything technical, I'll break it down if it's relevant. Yeah, my perspective here is architecture and governance, but really just trying to solve problems. I think in organizations we're still finding things difficult and they shouldn't be hard. Cool, so Vistaprint, let's cut off there, but this is, I feel quite lucky to be at this company. They've been around for about 30 years, started in print in manufacturing, and it was quite a competitive space. So they had to really like fight for their survival. They hired a bunch of MIT geniuses, and they really innovated and optimized their warehouses to become like the global leader in this print space. And that really established like their roots for being bold and innovating and just keeping things really efficient. And then in this digital space, let's move on from this slide. In the digital space, they needed to continue to innovate over the last few years and went through a change in the organization, which I'll speak to you about, and this is the people problem that I'm talking about. Now, this is a data eng conference. You want to see some numbers, so we've got some 400 DAGs. We've got like 800 engineers using all of these clients, consuming data, writing data. There's a lot going on, so let's see how it makes sense with teams. So the agenda for today, organizing teams for data success, right? Just making sure that your teams are set up for success. The relationship between data producers and data consumers, and you'll probably naturally think of data contracts here, which is a pretty hot topic over the last few years. And then lastly, the interoperability of data across domains. And so if you were just paying attention in that last talk, thinking about these bounded contexts and domains to make sense of how to use that data. And try to inspire you to bring back that lost art form of data modeling, which I think Joe Rice will be talking about a bit later. Cool. So organizing teams, these are 3 books that I think have been quite significant in my getting an understanding around how to set up teams for success. Empowered and Team Topologies was quite significant in Vistaprint's like reorganization in the last 2 years. And then domain-driven design, which was referenced in that last talk, I think really just rounds out these concepts nicely when it comes to people. So empowered, unsurprisingly, how to empower product teams. And you can think of this 3-legged stool. You've got product management, you've got engineering and data, and you've got design. And the idea here is that these teams are self-sufficient, right? They can operate entirely on their own, and it's also about like trying to get them closer to the customer problem, making sure they understand the customer and they have the proficiencies to solve that problem. And Marty Kagan wrote this book, and he's got a nice quote here, which says, if you're just using your engineers to code, you're only getting about half their value. And it's quite an inspiring idea for leadership, just to like really give the freedom and autonomy to the team to solve the problems, to work together if they're empowered. So in the context of data, what does this mean, right? I like to think of it as making sure that the teams are set up for success when it comes to like the data responsibilities in their organization. And so, you know, what you imagine at most companies is you have a central data team, right? And you've got some stakeholders, they want a dashboard, so they go to the data team. Data team needs to find where this data exists in the company. They go to the engineers, they try to speak to like the different teams to figure out where their data is, make a dashboard, give it to the stakeholders, and then it breaks. And then they go back, and then they go back. And there's this massive bottleneck here if it's not clear by now. And that doesn't really scale. And it's not reasonable for one central data team to have all of that deep domain knowledge that's going on with all their different engineering teams. And that stuff's changing all the time as well. So like, let's remove this bottleneck, let's embed those capabilities into the product teams, and they should be responsible for it and let them speak directly to the stakeholders. And so, what does this have to do with me? So with these different high-level topics, I'm really trying to be mindful of like the context that we're in. And so empowered, the takeaway here from data is like capabilities, right? Our teams, are they set up for success, right? Do they have the data proficiencies to build out something, right? If there's a request coming from that team that is producing the data, can they build out those data sets? And do they have the domain expertise? So if you're asking someone to do that, they should be within the context of that team that's building that data, right? They've got the deep domain knowledge, the nuance of how that operational data should be consumed. And knowing your customer. So I think that's really the root of like empowered, is like putting them in the face of the customer problem. If there's a stakeholder, like really actually understand what they're looking for. The next book was Team Topology. And this one's quite interesting. It's about how to define these different types of teams. And there's different types of teams, and they have different interaction modes between the different teams. So if you think of a platform team, you know, they're operating within a specific scope. And a streamline team, this one you can think about like a normal product team focusing on a service or a feature. And so the idea here is that you contain the scope of what that team's focusing on, right? Reduce the cognitive load of what they need to do and the dependencies between different teams. So an example here is you can think about like a payment system, right? If everyone in the organization, if all the engineers across the organization are working on a payment system, then you're probably going to find that that system is heavily coupled into all different other parts, and there's a lot of dependencies. And if you're asking for data in the payment system, well, depending on who you ask, they'll probably have their own data sets. So you're getting a lot of like duplicate data sets, inconsistent definitions. There's no clear ownership of that data. And Team Topologies leans a lot on this idea of Conway's law. And this one, it's quite significant. I think it's nice to have at the back of your mind. You know, Melvin Conway's got this quote: "Any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure." So I had to go away and think about this one for a long time. I didn't really understand it the first time I read it. But the idea here is that the architecture of a system reflects the communication patterns of the team that's building that system. So for that payment system that we just spoke about, you know, if everyone's using it in the organization, then you're probably going to find the architecture of that system is like heavily coupled within that system. And so what Team Topologies talks about is like, let's flip that on its head. And let's create teams that reflect the systems. So like with a payment system, have a team working on it, right? Create that specific scope and the ownership of those data sets. And there's this cute comic here by, I think, Manu Cornet. I think he was at Google. And it kind of nicely depicts these topologies, right? If you think about Apple has a singular focus on hardware, really top-down approach, then all of these teams have to ladder directly into this singular vision, right? So it's really cohesive. Whereas, you know, something like Facebook, move fast and break things, right? These autonomous teams, and they're communicating this like network graph. I can go on, you can infer what you want from these graphs, but yeah, I think it's pretty cool. And so what does this have to do with me, right? We're talking about data. You're in your team, things are tough. What could be the problem, right? And I think it's this, for team topologies, my takeaway was ownership here, right? Having this defined scope, these clear owners of this data that's being produced. And if you get this right, then you have each team owning that scope. They're responsible for producing these clear data sets, and you end up with this singular, cohesive, non-overlapping dictionary of data sets, which is really nice. And I don't think this is nice in theory. I think if you can just have these challenging conversations to understand who the producers are of this system, then you can achieve this. So that's team topologies. And the third book here that I want to mention is domain-driven design. So referencing that last talk as well, right? It's how to design systems that reflect business reality, right? When he was talking about the operational data, those events, and how to reflect them in a business context. And in doing so, establishing this ubiquitous language, right? This shared language that different teams can use when they talk about a thing. And where team topologies was talking about how to create that bounded context, was talking about making sure that each team has this defined scope. Domain-driven design is really just about the definition of those domains, and it's that exercise of defining that, right? And so an example here, if you think about, let's say, projects, right? In Vistaprint, we've got a bunch of projects being delivered. Depending on the context of where that's coming from, it can mean very different things. And naturally, if a stakeholder wants to have a dashboard or some KPIs on projects, they may go to whoever they think has that data, maybe the transaction systems, and they'll produce a dashboard. But then someone in the design system has their own KPIs, and they look very different. And it's because they're not speaking the same language, right? Projects here in the payment system, the transactions could be project invoices, right? And in designs, it could be the way that a project is created in the user flow. And so making sure that we have these clearly defined data models and understanding the context when we talk about something and using that across the organization so that we're speaking the same language. And so what does this have to do with me? We're talking about language here, right? That we can establish a shared language, that we have these clear, defined data models and data definitions and defined bounded contexts so that we can speak the same language and so that we can really make sure that we're talking about the same thing, because source of truth could mean very different things depending on the context of that, of the domain. So that's all nice in theory, exactly, but you may not be in leadership, and even if you are, you're definitely not going to go for the whole restructuring the organization. So what's the point here? From my perspective, I think it's just about just understanding where your bottlenecks are, these interaction points between people and data. If you're finding that things aren't working, I often find that some of these themes clearly articulate that, and if you can articulate it, then you can work on solving them. But I also want to call out, there are no silver bullets. Central data teams work depending on your size of your organization, but then consider, as your company grows, maybe exercising some of these themes, right? Creating teams that have the specific context. So if you're going for new projects or new teams, maybe apply some of these themes. And if nothing else, just get a seat at the table. Understand that things shouldn't be this hard, and then be able to articulate it. And if a stakeholder has a request, maybe don't go to a central data team and they become this service request-based operation system, but go to a team that knows that data and get them to take on a bit more responsibility to produce that data, because they probably also want to be consuming that data themselves, right? So then you can actually get them to produce meaningful data sets that have that defined scope and that can be consumed by everyone else in the organization. So the next topic for today is relationships between data producers and data consumers. Because you may have empowered product teams, you may have a team that is fully autonomous and capable of building out these data sets. And you may have clearly defined scope and ownership with team topology. You have clear data owners and clear defined scope so that there's no duplicate data sets. And you may have this the domain-driven design, this ubiquitous language, we're all speaking the same thing. And so what happens? Dashboard's broken, so it doesn't really solve that, right? And this is where this idea of relationships come in. And typically because you have this kind of setup. You can have the engineering team, the product team, that has their operational data. Someone wants to create a dashboard, they do so. But it's this non-consensual consumption of data, right? And so if something changes upstream, no one's notified downstream. And that's fair, right? They don't really have an incentive to do so, there's no responsibility there. But again, this is a people problem, right? How can we solve this? In terms of people and data. And it's particularly relevant more and more in these days because everyone wants AI, but you lift up the lid and it's the Wild West underneath. And so can we create this communication mechanism for reliable data consumption? And that's this idea of data contracts, right? You've got an operational data set or maybe a data product and downstream they want to consume it. Can we do so? And can we get clear observability? Can the upstream team, the producers, know who's consuming their data downstream? If they should even be consuming this data set, maybe that's not relevant anymore. And downstream, can they know when schema changes? Can they react to get ahead of it and make sure that their dashboards don't break? Accountability, SLAs, all that good stuff. And if you do that, you kind of then lean nicely into this data mesh framework. I don't want to talk too much about data mesh because I think with everything, there's a right and wrong way to do it, and you also need to make sure to find what works for you. And so, but high level, right, if you just have these clear communication mechanisms, I think this becomes quite powerful. And a bit more of an advanced comment to make on data contracts is, there could be multiple boundaries where these contracts exist, right? So it's not just the operational data and then production data sets, but from data consumers and data producers. But maybe once those data sets have been created by the data consumers, there could be more contracts downstream, right? If you've got AI products or anything consuming downstream. So just also being aware of that as well. And so what does this have to do with me? Relationships. Because your company may not be mature enough to implement a full-blown technical data contract implementation. And we're also talking about the fact that shiny tools don't necessarily solve the problems. And so at a minimum, you can just start fostering the relationship between these two entities. The data producers at a minimum should understand who's consuming their stuff downstream, right? And similarly for data consumers, they want to know when things change upstream. They want to get ahead of it. So the final topic for this talk is the interoperability of data across domains. And that's because, let's say we have empowered product teams. And let's say with team topologies, we have clear ownership, clear scope. And let's say we're all speaking the same language and we've implemented data contracts, we're golden, right? But then you still find when you're in a company which has all that good stuff, it's still quite challenging to ask a new question, to innovate, right? When we saw that chasm where it went from prescriptive to predictive and all of that, we want to start innovating. We want to get to that golden age of AI and everything. So how can we solve this? Data modeling, if it works. Here we go, cool. So I want to bring in that, bring back the lost love for data modeling. I think it's really powerful, and share how, at least at Vistaprint, it really allows for this. So just high level data modeling, you can think about it as taking operational data, that raw data, turning it into business concepts. And the idea is that if we have each team doing that, then we have this clear, cohesive, singular data dictionary, and teams can start consuming that data themselves, right? But we want to go a bit further, and we want to be able to join those data sets together to really start to innovate. I'm more of a visual learner, so this is kind of how I approached it back in the day at 99 Designs. And if you think about it, you've got all of these raw application data sets. If you're into DBT, you do the whole staging layer. And then you get these core data sets, right? And if we take everything that we've learned from that first topic where we have clear ownership, clear teams that can produce these core data sets, that's amazing, right? These bounded domain contexts. And then downstream, if you want to have some domain-specific, idiosyncratic types of like one big table mess stuff, go for it. But at least we're all referencing that same cohesive, singular dictionary of like core data sets. And we can eliminate circular dependencies, and we can get some really interesting like interoperability across domains. Now, like practically how to do that, because all of this is nice in theory, I can give one suggestion, and that's Kimball modeling. There's different types of data modeling. There's a lot of infighting about which one's better. I like to just try to be practical, try to find things that make sense, that's easy to digest, to explain to the rest of the organization. If there's these product teams that now are going to be producing data sets, what's the quickest way that I can teach them to do this? And I found this to like really cover quite a lot of use cases and to really highlight that interoperability of data. And appreciating the audience here, I'm going to keep it light, but really show how it can be very powerful. So high level, you can just think about it as two tables. You've got dimension tables. You can think of these as like nouns, as objects of things in your company. It could be orders, it could be users, it's these things. And facts, they're your events, right? Typically that's how you would measure stuff in your company. If there were no events, company's looking pretty static. And events typically have things associated with them, right? If there's an order created, that's an event. There's order associated. Maybe there's a user associated who created that order. And if you get that into your head, then you can think about this like star schema where you've got the fact at the center, it's the events. Try to think about all the business events that are happening in your company, and then you join them to the dimensions, to the objects by the foreign keys and all of that. So high level Kimball modeling 101. And why I'm showing that, explaining that, because I think, so this is Looker, but any BI tool, right? As an example, you've got an explore, you want to explore some data. You explore the event, you aggregate the event, and you join it to the dimensions, just like in that star schema. And so you can see here, you've got the fact, you've got the orders created, and then the dimensions, right? Now, if we take what we've just learnt about like having these empowered product teams that have their clear scope, they're creating these dimension tables, or facts and dimension tables. But if one team is within the scope of like, let's say, the products, whatever that team, whatever that system is, and then there's a change to it, right? They create a new attribute for that product. They add it to their core model behind the scenes, and then that's proliferated throughout the entire like warehouse, BI tool, if we're just leaning on this like Kimball modeling way of doing things. And that's really powerful, right? It leans into that like self-serve nature, and also being able to join it to different domains. And I think this like just really highlights that power of like the proliferation of data consumption everywhere. And if we think about that first talk on data catalogs, right? A tool is great, but if you don't have the teams using it, contributing to it properly, it doesn't really work. So let's recap. Let's go through everything we've learned. So high level, are your teams set up for success, right? Are they self-sufficient? Can they produce those data sets themselves? Are they close to the customer problem? Are they accountable in team topologies? Do we have clear domain ownership, right? If everyone owns a system, then no one owns it. And you're getting duplicate data sets, inconsistent data sets. And so do we have that clear, defined scope? And then with domain-driven design, are we speaking the same language? Do we have a clear definition of what something is in our business? Have we defined the different business contexts? And that's all great, but we need to be able to produce and consume that data reliably. And so can we implement some sort of data contracts between people, between these teams? And if we do that well, then we can have this like this mesh of data sets, right? That we can have different teams consuming different data sets reliably. And then finally, with the interoperability of data, can you harness the true potential of your data, right? Can we go that one step further and innovate and get people just asking their own questions, answering them very easily. And giving just one example with Kimball modeling, but choose whatever flavor you want, but just understanding that we need to be able to take that operational data and produce these like composable, usable, non-overlapping data sets that can be stitched together nicely. Yeah, hopefully that was relatively interesting. That's it.